and welcome everyone to the Copenhagen Fashion Week's talk series. My name is Sandra Gonza, and I'm an Impact Program Manager at Global Fashion Agenda. With me here today is Emily Chan, Sustainability Editor at Vogue, Lauren Bartley, Head of Responsibility at GANNI, and Laura Coppen, Head of Circularity at Zalando. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. And so today we're here to really talk about the role that circularity can play in solving some of the sustainability challenges that the fashion industry is currently facing. Everybody seems to be talking about the circular economy, but what does it really imply for fashion? And how can we actually use it to create a meaningful change within the industry? So this is maybe the opening question that I'd like to start with. And maybe Emily, you could kick us off in your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think for me, circularity is about creating this system where all the products, that are produced within the fashion industry can be put back into that system. So whether that's, reusing, recycling, returning to the earth, I think this idea of regeneration, how can fashion actually give back to the planet is really important. And I think, the way to think about it is kind of the opposite of the system that the majority of the fashion industry currently kind of operates on, which is a linear system where, natural resources are taken and then products are created, and then, often those products end up in landfill or are burned. So that's the kind of the linear way of working that, the fashion industry has traditionally operated on. So circularity is more thinking about how do we, reuse those materials, reuse those products, and create a circular loop, essentially. I think that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, it is really thinking about the materials and how we're really using them regeneratively. And so maybe, Lauren, if we look at what's happening at GANNI, what are you putting in place and how are you addressing this?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, completely echoing the points already made. I think that's exactly it. If you're bringing a product out into the world, you do have a responsibility to ensure that it's handled in the best way during its life and considered after its life as well. For GANNI, we take like a very holistic approach when it comes to circular economy, and it really is tackling all parts of the model rather than just like cherry picking some aspects of it. So for us, that's the raw materials that we're using, whether they be more responsible or now more of these like innovations that we're seeing out in the market, and then how it's designed. So are we designing it and putting it in a position where it could be repaired, recycled, reused? And that's a really big project for us currently. And then it's obviously the use phase. So looking at secondhand business models, rental, repairs, things like that. And then obviously then towards the end, so recycling. So how do we get to a place where we can enable fiber to fiber recycling, which is obviously the goal for a lot of brands these days. But I think we've got a big challenge ahead of us. But I think also the progress that's been made in that area over the last 2 years has been phenomenal. So it's a really exciting space to be in. And then obviously if it cannot be, recycled or upcycled into something new, then if it is waste, how do we treat that, and how can it still become something, if not a fashion product? So many areas to tackle for sure.
Indeed. And I mean, Lauren, if we look at what you're doing at Zalando, how would you address the potential for circularity to solve some of the challenges that we're seeing in the industry?
So firstly, I think Emily captured the comparison of the linear to a circular economy really well, and fully back everything that she just mentioned. And similarly to what Lauren mentioned about the work going on at GANNI, at Zalando, we also have a full product life cycle, the holistic view of a product in mind in our circularity strategy. So it starts, of course, with how a product is designed and manufactured, where typically the largest environmental impact of a product occurs at this stage. So through the material choices, processes used in manufacturing. So it's really important that we redesign how products are designed. So we are looking at circular design criteria. We are creating that in collaboration with Circular Fashion, which is a Berlin-based startup. using the Ellen MacArthur Foundation design principles, so made with safe, recycled, renewable inputs, designed to last longer, so the technical durability, and designed to be recycled or returned to the earth at the end of a product's useful life. So this criteria will really enable brands and retailers to design with a criteria, a framework that can be used for many, which is super important. And then in the use phase, we are testing out care and repair services in Berlin, enabling customers to extend the life of items that they already own, that they love and they cherish, and they want to keep in use. And then in the reuse phase, we have our re-commerce business that has been scaling up in the last year from 7 to 13 markets, with a growing assortment offered to our customers. And then in the end of life stage, or what we call the closing the loop stage, we have invested in 2 recycling technologies last year. So Infinited Fiber Company, which is based in Finland, that recycles cellulosic-based textiles into a high-quality material output, and Ambercycle, that takes polyester garments, blended textiles, and recycles them back into a high-quality polyester, virgin polyester that can be reused over and over again. And it's really important to have that holistic view because, exactly as Lauren said, it shouldn't be about cherry-picking one stage over another. It's really important to see a product life cycle in its entirety. And for us, on the last point, we have our vision to have a net positive impact on people and planet. So we are committed then to making our business and the industry better, to be a business that doesn't just do less bad, but fundamentally makes the world a better place for generations to come. And circularity is a great enabler of that net positive vision, which looks to eliminate waste and pollution, circulate materials and products, and regenerate natural systems. But we can't do it alone. This requires, industry partnerships, and that is fundamental to create that change from a linear to a circular economy.
Laura, I think you all 3 capture very different angles of it. But I think one of the questions that really comes to mind as we're speaking about this, I think Laura, you just mentioned moving towards a net positive impact of basically circularity can help us enable getting to that level. But then do you know of any examples that we can look at how circularity can address climate issues specifically? And maybe issues such as overconsumption. I think in multiple cases, I think we've heard the rental model. We've talked about different circularity models, business models that can come as an advantage of this. But how are they specifically tackling some of these issues, especially overconsumption, which seems to be the major issue that's going on now? And happy for maybe Emily to take it over, but happy for this to just be a conversation. Jump in if you have anything that you feel really answers this.
Yeah, I think for me, in terms of this issue of circularity and how it can address overconsumption, I think it's important to remember that we are still quite far off achieving this idea of a circular fashion model. And even though there are elements that are exciting, for example, resale and rental and the rise of, fiber to fiber recycling, I think, as Lauren pointed out, there's still a long way to go in terms of those technologies as well. So I think it's important to remember that, circularity can't be a distraction or an excuse for not, tackling some of these real issues in terms of, getting greenhouse gas emissions down and actually, just producing less product in the first place. And I think that will be essential anyway in terms of actually achieving a more circular system, is that, we can't have this constant production of more and more products. But obviously, if some of these alternative business models kind of become more increasingly popular, hopefully, that will offset some of the kind of virgin production that's taking place. And obviously, if resources and materials can be, re-entered in the system again, hopefully that will help address some of fashion's climate impacts. But again, I do think it's important to remember that we are a long way off, and we still do have to kind of tackle the root issues, while, obviously focusing on a more circular way of designing and producing, but yeah, remembering that the core issues kind of need to be tackled at their root.
Yeah. No, thank you very
Yeah,
much. I
I
mean,
think
I think the collaborative side indeed is really key to this. I think, Lauren, sorry, I cut you off. Go on.
no, I was just going to agree with what Emily said, and I don't think we can see circularity as the silver bullet to solve the climate crisis, but I do think it can go some way to helping us achieve the 1.5-degree target. And I also think, and I think we're starting to also see rising conversations, but circularity and overproduction are also two different things. And I think what we'll start to see more this year is the separation between the two, that circularity does not mean less consumption, but it does mean lots of other positive things.
And maybe just to also add, I think everything that's been said, fully agree with. And I think the fundamental problems we're all very aware of now, 73% of clothing is thrown away that could have been reused, could have been repaired, could have maybe been recycled, but it sadly isn't. And that's partly due to, not having the systems and infrastructure in place to enable that. To Emily's point that, recycling technologies aren't scaled. Yes, they're not scaled. That is a fundamental problem, and they need to scale to reach the size and scale of the problem today. Only 1% of textiles are recycled back into new textiles. But I think it's super exciting to see promising technologies out there. It is a long-term change. And I think it also comes down to not just the technologies, but it also comes down to customer behaviors. So, specifically looking at some industry statistics that, clothing production has doubled since 2002, and customers are buying 60% more, and they're not keeping those products for nearly as long as they used to. And these numbers are really shocking, and it needs to change. And we need to provide customers with information about their products that they purchase, how to take better care of them, how to keep them in use for longer, and then how to, when they don't want it anymore, because that happens, that's a natural thing, you change your mind, you might change your size. How can you enable them to do the right thing with that product as opposed to throwing it away? So the really important things are, enabling customers, enabling the technologies that will create some of the solutions to these problems. But I mean, the bitter reality is the fashion industry is part of these global problems, and we can't shy away from that. We produce too much, consumers are buying more, they're wearing those items less, and items are left unworn in wardrobes, and products end up being incinerated or landfilled. And these problems are very, very apparent, and we need to change them. And circularity is part of the solution, but indeed it's not going to solve the full problem of the climate crisis, and that needs to be addressed with other technologies and solutions in sync that need to scale, really quickly to solve the problem of our world today.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I'd like to pick up two main things, I think, that came out of this as well. I think, Lauren, you just said that really, when we're talking about circularity, it does not necessarily equal less consumption. It definitely can result in other benefits, but it's not necessarily circularity equals underconsumption or less consumption in this case. The other thing also is really talking about how do we scale this? Because I think we are seeing so many pilots coming about right now in the industry. Everybody's trying to figure out all these different solutions. I think brands are trying out, whether it's within their design, within the materials they're using, they're all trying to figure out different solutions. And maybe one question, again, would be, how do we actually scale these initiatives? I think we've seen the business case is there, the solutions exist, but how do we scale this? What do we need to make this possible? Lauren, would you like to just take it on from there? Then.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, in GANNI's experience, we run a project called Fabrics of the Future, where we're looking at these innovations on the markets and solutions for conventional materials or even more responsible ones, and how do we work with them. And GANNI is still a relatively small company, so it's not, like we have a ton of financial means to support these businesses, but there's definitely ways that we can start working with them. And what's become really clear in that process is a lot of these innovations and startups out there need brands to place a bet and work with them in order for them to get funding to scale and to develop. So you're really like having to work with them in partnership, hand in hand, and probably paying more than you would for a more responsible product. And maybe it's not performing as it should right now in terms of quality, price, durability. It's not scalable. And these are all the things that we as a brand need to take into consideration. But at the same time, we want these to become a success. So we have to try and work with them. And that's a really big piece of work that we've been trying to action on for the past 2 years. And only now this year are we going to start seeing some of those innovations come out to the market, which is obviously really exciting, but it's taken some time. And I think right now this is very much between like brand and that startup innovation to figure it out. And I do think there needs to be more government intervention or incentives for these companies to be able to thrive and scale. I think that's what I'd say.
Perfect, thank you. I mean, if we look at what infrastructure exists, I think definitely brands can have a big role to play in here. But then, what regulatory frameworks do we need? What legislation? I think we're seeing the EU start to come up with some of the solutions within the legal and legislative infrastructure. But I mean, Emily, I think, would you be able to contribute? What do you think we need in terms of the legal frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means a legislative expert. It's something that I have written about and kind of looked a bit into. And I think the really interesting kind of type of legislation that's coming up is this idea of extended producer responsibility, which France already has in place, and I believe Sweden now has in place since the start of this year. And that really puts the onus on brands to be responsible for their products at the end of their life cycle. So financially responsible for recycling them, sorting them, collecting them, recycling those products, which I think is really interesting. And I think hopefully will mean that brands actually do think about, the entire life cycle of their products, as Lauren and Laura were saying. And also, produce, as we were saying about overproduction, produce less if they're actually having to be responsible for what happens at the end of their life cycle, then I feel like that is an incentive for them to produce less in the first place. But I think that is an exciting kind of type of legislation that I think the EU are considering now, and will really kind of move the dial forward when it comes to creating these more circular systems and hopefully creating more investment and infrastructure that's needed to create a more circular fashion industry.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, again, there, especially in terms of the extended responsibilities around this, I think when we look at the legal framework that's supporting this, I think one of the things Laura just said as well was, how do you enable the consumer side? I think one side is, what are the brands doing to scale and work with the technologies that are coming up? But I think the other side is also, what can we do to enable the consumers or the customers to actually keep their products for longer, use their products, and dispose of them well? So in this transition towards a circular business, what does it actually mean for people? This is the consumer side, but also what could it mean for some of your people within the supply chain? So I think, speaking from the brand side, it also means a systems transformation. So what's happening to the people within this transformation? And I don't know, Laura, could you kick us off there?
Yeah, sure. So I guess maybe just to address the social aspect that you mentioned first. So I think typically when we talk about circularity, we don't talk about the social aspect enough. And that's something that needs to change. We need to talk about the job opportunities that are created with different circular models. And we need to see how that changes from, the supply chain when a product is made right through to how products are sorted to be recycled. So for us, we are engaging with a few sort of researchers, specifically PhD researchers on the topic of social circularity, to understand this more. I would say it's still quite early in terms of conversations, but I think there needs to be a much bigger spotlight on the social aspects, because we typically focus more on the environmental aspects of circularity. So we can't forget the social aspect. When it comes to your second point around customers or citizens, we did some research last year called the attitude behavior gap. And we saw the largest attitude behavior gap in the circular model space. So that means that we saw very high numbers of attitudes, belief from customers that they want to repair, that they want to trade in items to be resold, and they want to recycle products. But the unfortunate thing is that it was very low behaviors. So they're not actioning their beliefs and their wants. And this is partly due to lack of clarity of where to go for some of these solutions, the lack of ease in offering these opportunities. And I think it starts with making it accessible, easy, convenient. This is really important to reach that critical mass of customers adopting these models and changing their behaviors. And I think something that we see is that with that attitude behavior gap being quite large in the circular space, that's a problem that's worth solving. We're basically being told customers are motivated by these opportunities. And that's a problem that, businesses, brands, retailers, you name it, can solve. And that can be prioritized. And I think when putting that into perspective, at Zalando. So one example is we have a collection from our private labels called Redesign. And these products have been designed with circular principles that I mentioned earlier. They also have a QR code on them. So it's attached to a digital product passport that is powered by our partner Eon. Customers can scan this QR code and they see information, transparent information about how that product was produced, where, etc. It also shows how to take better care of that product with engaging, simple video tutorials. It also then provides an easy click to trade in the item when you no longer want it, and ease in understanding what happens to that product specifically based on the material inputs when it is recycled. So it can be recycled, and this is how it would happen. And so this collection aims to educate, inspire our customers and to help them understand more. But I think what's fundamental is circularity is complex. We need to break it down, we need to make it actionable, and we need to make it relevant, interesting, and engaging. It doesn't have to be, heavy on your heartstrings. It can be also fun, playful, and education, and making it relevant for our customers is then really, really important to change behaviors towards circular business models.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. So, Lauren, how can we ensure this just and fair transition towards circularity? And what are you guys doing at GANNI?
Yeah, I think it's a very new topic for us to consider, as the work on circularity is also new. And I think there's two conversations happening in parallel across the industry. One is around, the transitioning to a circular economy can create millions of jobs. I think it's maybe like 6 million new jobs. But also the other side of the coin is that there's a lot of low income communities that are really thriving or surviving on a linear model. And so for a fashion brand such as GANNI, we work with suppliers in multiple countries, and some of them are, providing us a service based on the linear model. And so I think things that we've done are honestly vary at a micro level right now. I think there definitely needs to be government intervention and social protection if we are to transition into a circular economy. But what's happening at GANNI at a micro scale is we're working with a lot of existing suppliers that we already have, and working with them on upcycling initiatives, and also hand in hand again with these innovative fabrics that we're working with. So a lot of bio-based alternatives, or alternatives to leather, which are also very new and difficult for a supplier to work with. And in one sense, you could say that it might be a bit easier for GANNI to go and find a new supplier that has more experience in working in this area, but we're making a conscious choice not to do that, and really spending the time making sure that our suppliers feel confident and equipped and upskilled in a way to work with new innovative materials or new processes. And so that's the way I'd say that we are addressing it right now. But I think there's definitely a lot more work to do. There's also a really interesting report by Chatham House that talks about this just transition. I think I would really recommend everyone to go and read it, honestly. I think it's really insightful and can really provide us with some solutions or considerations when transitioning to a circular economy.
Thank you, Lauren. And so maybe just one final question is, we've heard what you can be doing at the brands and their brand's role within this just transition, but what can citizens go out and do? What can they go out and do now after listening to this? And Emily maybe can kick us off.
Yeah, of course. And I do think what Laura was saying about making it as easy and as accessible as possible for consumers or citizens is really important. I think that, it's hard for them to know what the right thing to do is when, there is a lot of, lack of transparency essentially still. And, the kind of convenience aspect, you know, how do they actually go about recycling their clothes? I think that the kind of rise of things like resale and rental does make it easier for consumers to kind of be able to do their part, be able to ensure that their clothes actually get a second life, that they can take part in the kind of rental economy. I think those are really exciting ways. I think that in terms of recycling, the fact that so many of our clothes, currently aren't recycled, that makes it a difficult ask for the consumer, I guess, because how do they actually correctly dispose of those clothes? At the moment, it doesn't seem those infrastructures are really in place. But I think we can talk about what the consumers can do, and I know that a lot of the conversation has been around what brands need to do, and I do think that there need to be better options out there for consumers. It needs to, as Laura was saying, be as easy as possible for them. And I think this kind of cultural change, behavioral change will probably take longer. And as we know that we don't have that much time. So it's kind of, how can the industry really take consumers along with them rather than putting too much onus on the consumers themselves, I think.
It for today. I think we are at time. So thank you so much for tuning in on this talk. And yeah, have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.